So we're going to start with our bond sale results. We actually sold bonds earlier this week on November 30th, and we had very good results. So we sold bonds of about $9.3 million, which yields $10 million. So that's due to the discount on the bonds, but just so everyone knows, that gets us $10 million, which is what our goal was. This is a bank qualified issue. Basically what that means is that we can do up to $10 million of bank qualified each year. It's not through a bank, it's just the terminology. They are still bonds, but that gets us a lower interest rate. We've also talked throughout the years, we are rated by rating agencies because of our financial health. We have a very good rating in the district, and what that enables us to do is when people buy our bonds, they generally do not require us to have insurance, bond insurance. That saved us about $25,000 because they did not require us to have that bond insurance. So that's a great point. And as you look at these bonds, the effective interest rate is about 1.43%, so very low. So trying to put that into something that's understandable, when we did the bonds in 2019, we got a really good rate, effective rate at that time of 2.52%, but you can see how much better it was with these bonds. And that's what we were talking about last time at the last meeting, where we've got to look at both the borrowing environment and the building environment together, because they kind of have to go hand in hand. So these bonds sold for approximately $800,000 better than the conservative estimate we brought forth in our plan. But I also want to say that compared to the bonds of 2019, we're talking $2.5 to $2.9 million difference in overall cost. So these interest rates, it's big dollars. So I really want people to understand, like, when we say that, we really are looking at both pieces. And I know, me personally, I'm extremely conservative. And as we look at going over budget or our bids for the high school, we really do take that very seriously. And we really are looking at both pieces of these puzzles. So I really want to make sure everyone understands this is a really big deal that we can borrow for these very low rates. So just want to kind of make sure that there's an understanding of that, because I sometimes struggle with these things too, but we have to look at it overall in the whole piece of it. So it's definitely, the sale of the bonds this week has definitely positively impacted our overall financial plan for the building project. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that too, because I think there was a little bit of confusion on some things. So I want to kind of make sure that we can clear a couple things up. Any questions on the bonds before I go into the next piece? Okay. So our long-term financial plan, as we said, we started that way back in October of 2017. And then we did our facility study in October of 2018. And as we worked through this, we actually looked at phasing this in slowly. So we have been phasing in our financial plan for years. It's not like we're going to just start it this year. So that's the piece that I want to make sure that we have an understanding of. It's been phased in slowly, and really this is to reduce the overall impact. So as you phase it in slowly, there's two pieces of it. There's the millage, and we'll talk about that. That's the tax rate. We'll talk about the importance of that and what that means. But there's also putting cash back for the projects too. So it's kind of like making sure we're doing both pieces of this, because bottom line is, whether you have a great effective interest rate or not, it's still better not to issue bonds if you can put cash aside to do the same thing. So we're kind of working on both of those pieces. Of course, we're never going to be able to put the kind of money we need all back, but we're trying to do both pieces of that to be as fiscally responsible as possible. So I think sometimes I throw things out like we have to have millage in place, we have to have this in place, and I don't think there's an understanding, and I'll take full blame for that, and I got to do a better job of making sure people understand that we need to make sure there's money in place to pay our debt. So really that's what we're saying. When we say we want to put millage in place, we need to make sure there's money in place that's going to be reoccurring each year to pay that debt payment. It's like paying your mortgage payment. So there's two types of bills. There's one-time bills and there's recurring bills. So as we talked about last month, and I want to reiterate, if you, like at home, if you buy new furniture, it's a relatively small purchase, pretty big, but relatively small. you could take a one-time source of money, a gift or a Christmas present or whatever, and you could pay for your furniture with that. But you can't pay your mortgage payments with one-time money like that. And we're in that same situation here. When we issue bonds, it's reoccurring debt. We have to make sure that there's a reoccurring source of money coming in for it. So that's why I want to make sure we all understood that. And with these large capital projects that we're talking about, there is that reoccurring piece. We're trying to put some back to mitigate it, but we also have that reoccurring piece. So how do we make sure that money's in place? So our district revenues are made up of federal, state, and local revenues. But we all know the big part, the big blue piece, is real estate taxes. So as you can see, pretty much most of the money we get is real estate taxes. And the only revenue that we have control over and can make any change on, right, wrong, or indifferent, and I'm not saying it's right or it's wrong, but that is the only source of revenue or money that we have coming in that we have any ability to change. So people always say, why is it that real estate taxes is always what changes? That's the only thing we have anything that we can change. There's no other piece of this that we have any ability to change. So I'm not saying it's the right answer, but I'm saying it's really the only answer as far as if you need additional sources of money. That's the option. So, and then there's two parts to a real estate tax bill. So we have the real estate assessment and we have the millage tax rate. So we're going to talk about that briefly. So assessment versus market value. Properties are assessed by the York County Assessment Office one time. So your property is assessed when you build your house. Assessments can only change under the following conditions. So rarely does an assessment change. So I think there were some comments on, it changes with inflation or changes with this or that. Assessments actually only change under two conditions. The first is they can change if there's a change to your property. So for instance, if you do an addition to your home, you put in a pool, you put in a fence, you put up a shed. So that's anything you need a permit for could change your assessment. But if you make no changes to your property, your assessment doesn't change. The only other way assessment changes is if there's a total reassessment at the county level. So York County does a complete reassessment. The last reassessment in York County was in 2004, and it became effective for us 2006. So basically what our assessments are meant to be, and I'll say it this way because we're not the assessors, York County is, but they're meant to be representative of the market value on July 1st, 2004. So when you look at it, that's what it's meant to represent. So when they put a new property on, say we build a house, it's meant to represent the market value as of 7/1/2004. So, that's really, it is a stagnant number, again, unless you change the property, and then any additions would be valued per the assessment office as of that 7/1/2004 date, not current market value. So I wanted to kind of show examples of why this is important. We took a couple properties in our district that just recently sold, and we compared the assessed value, so what your tax bill is based upon, versus what the sale price is. So as you can see, basically for most properties, it's about 50%. Some higher, some lower. It's not a perfect science, but if you look at the actual market value, which is your sale price, it's about 50%. So that's why as we're looking at this, I just want to make sure we understand the assessment piece. So then your second part of this equation is millage. So I think sometimes folks get hung up on the word millage because it is a strange Pennsylvania word that basically means tax rate. And I see some people laughing. Yes, it is unless you work in schools, you're like, what's millage? So it basically is your tax rate. So how it works is you take your assessment that we just talked about, and then you take your tax rate, you divide your tax rate by 1,000 and multiply it by your assessment. So that's just basically, it's a calculation. So like a lot of things, it's just a calculation, but it's a rate. It's a rate based upon this formula, and that's how you come up with your tax bill. But I just want to make sure that there was an understanding of what that is. And millage is what changes on your tax bill, because again, that assessment piece is stagnant. unless you did the additions. Any questions there? Or can we keep going? Whoops. So if you look at millage, the one thing that's important to note, again, that tax rate, and so I don't keep using verbiage, that tax rate, we are lower than our other local districts. And the one thing that's important to see, because I've heard things like, oh, well, such and such district hasn't raised taxes in 5 years. And the one thing I want to make sure that everybody understands is if they have a significantly higher tax rate, which as you see, many of them do, if we had that tax rate, we would have quite a bit more revenue than what we have. So, I mean, I want to be careful with this in saying I'm not throwing our neighbors under the bus in any way, but I want to make sure we're comparing too that when you have a lower rate on something, you're already far below where other people are in their ability to generate revenue. So I just want to make sure, I wanted to make that point. And, you know, one thing that we do very much pride ourselves on is Bruce spoke about the PD index, the ability to raise taxes to a certain index. And I can say 100%, it has never been, since I've been here for a very long time, it's never been the intent to raise to the index. We look at what's necessary, and that's what's brought forth to the board as a recommendation. So our average over the last 10 years has been about 1.7% versus the index has been 2.75%. So again, it's not, I mean, there's been some years we've gone to the index. I'm going to be completely transparent, but that was because it was necessary. We may have had a situation or something going on. I'm not saying we're not going to. I'm saying we're not going to look at that and say that's what we're raising taxes to. We're going to raise taxes to what we think is absolutely necessary to balance the budget. So how does this all apply to the long-range financial plan? Because that's what we're talking about. Putting that money in place, as we started with, you have to put the money in place as you're doing these projects to make sure that you can pay the debt for the long term. And so really that's the concept behind this, making sure we get that money in place. And if we do it slowly, it does two things. The two things are, it does it slowly, which is less of an impact to our community members, but it also then, as that millage is in place ahead of time, we are putting that cash into reserve for the projects. The more cash you can put into reserve, the less you're borrowing bonds. And like I said before, even if it's a low interest rate, it's always better not to borrow if you can prevent that. So really, it's kind of a two-pronged approach to try to make this as less of a difficult thing for our community as possible, but be able to update our buildings. So when we talked last month about the need for millage over the next several years, I want to be clear, that was for all of the projects, not the high school. So we pretty much have the millage in place for the high school project. But if we want to continue to put the millage in place so that we can do the rest of the projects, and we want to do it slow and gradually, we need to keep following this plan. And that's really what the concept is there. So the other three projects, Shrewsbury Elementary School was built in 1997, so we're nearing 25 years. It is 120,000 square feet. So I know for me, sometimes I have to put those numbers down because you think of your own house at 2,000 or 2,500 square feet. We're talking many, many houses inside of these very, very large buildings with very large systems. The other thing that is important as we look at the needs of our buildings, it's a little different than your home. We can't shut a school down for a year so that we can get folks in there to renovate it. We need to do it while the students are in place. We don't have another place for them to go. So again, that's what makes some of these things a little more complicated. As much as we can, we want to use the same business practices that we use in other industries, but we are a school, so we are different. And it's something I have to continue to remind myself too, that things are different when you're renovating a school than renovating some other buildings or things. So again, this shows you our other buildings and the age of our buildings. Again, we have beautiful buildings that we want to make sure we keep updated for years to come. So the millage or the tax rate phase-in is to do all of our projects. We have I can now say, last month I said it took about 0.3 of a mil each year. We're now down to 0.28 mils because of our bond results that came in positively, and we're hoping that's going to continue to go down as we move forward. And the idea again is to gradually put the money in place to pay the debt service payments, and using that combination of committing cash reserves to the project and phasing in this tax rate so that the impact is less to the community. So questions on that?
Any questions? Just like to share a comment for what it's worth. A wise man that was in your position many years ago named Dale Kagi explained bonds to me in a way that I understood, and now I understand why we sell bonds. He said, you would never want to sell bonds to pay your operating expenses. That would be foolish. He said, but I was saying we should put as much money aside for these building projects and pay it up front. He says, you really don't want to do that. You know, the people that are going to get the long-term benefit of that are 15, 20 years away. They should help contribute to paying for what we're doing right now to improve the facilities. So, you know, that stuck with me, and I'll share it for what it's worth.
Mm-hmm.
Any other comments or questions?
I have a question. I understand what you're saying about building it in, and that makes sense to me. So I guess the other question I have is, you know, when we look at our budgets every year, you know, and I don't know the answer to this, but I mean, you know, we have changing populations, right? More kids, less kids, depending on where we are.
Mm-hmm.
Has there ever been a year where we've actually reduced our budget?
Reduced our budget?
Mm-hmm. So in other words, we would do an audit and we would maybe say, you know what, we have less students, we have less services, you know, we don't need to do that. So it's just a question, it's not a statement, I'm just asking.
Yeah, and the reason I hesitated, I think we had years where the budget, I think the lowest went up $128,000. Like, I mean, I think it was pretty much break even.
Right.
But I'm not sure that it's ever declined.
Mm-hmm.
Now, certain areas in the budget have definitely declined, but I'm not sure the actual budget has declined. And I think the one thing to remember too, as we work through it, and we're always kind of trying to analyze that, as we look at student population, we always have to be careful too that it's over 13 grade levels. And so one of the things that I struggle with sometimes and have to kind of go back and look at the breakdown of is if we have 50 or 75 less children or what have you, they're so spread out over 13 grade levels that you may or may not be able to reduce teachers. So, but we have reduced areas. So let me kind of give you an example of that. For instance, we may not need as many X teachers, elementary, secondary, whichever you want to say. But then we're always looking, as we talked about last time, bringing back programs to be more efficient. So we've brought back a lot of special needs programs. So again, a lot of it becomes, it's not quite as clear cut as reducing the budget, I don't think, from the standpoint of we're reducing areas, but then there may be a need over here or something else that's going on over here. So I think that's where I kind of hesitated for a minute with your question.
Well, that's a great explanation, thank you.
Any other questions?
Well, I also want to point out, it was on one of the slides, but I don't think you specifically mentioned it, is that in 3 out of the last 10 years, we haven't raised taxes at all. So while that may not be a decrease in budget, we've stayed flat on, you know, carrying over, not raising taxes. And to be the lowest in the county on millage and also not raise taxes, I mean, I think that's just indicate what a good job our financial team is doing. And I thought the presentation was great. So I've been here a long time and I still I still learned things from that slide presentation, so thank you.
Yeah, and I was going to say thank you, Mrs. Green, too, for going back and re-clarifying some things from last month and just breaking down to give very specific examples in each of the areas, because it is such a complex budget process. It's different from the private sector. There's so many stipulations that, as Bobby just said, President Schefter just said, the more we hear it, the more it helps to bring clarity for our community, for everyone. We also talked about today that as we send out emails or different notifications about the budget, we're going to this presentation tonight will be videotaped, and there'll be a link. It has been, obviously. The link will go into that email so folks can rewatch it again, and we're able to send those emails directly to folks, and they don't have to try and work through things on the website to find specifics. So we also talked about making sure that we have a bank, that we save some banks of videos in different areas, whether it's curriculum topics, budget topics, different, so folks can go back in and watch it at a time that they may have questions or it's relevant at that point in time. So we're trying to continue to do that as we expand our communications.
Other comments or questions? Just one final thing, please extend our thanks to everybody that made the bond sale so successful. That's really good news.
Will do, thank you.
Excellent.
That concludes my report, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Baumann.